Hello and welcome to News Blitzer. You've been told a story about the crash of Air India 171. It's a simple story, a story about a deliberate, shocking act by the pilots in their final moments. It's a story that gives you a simple answer and a clear person to blame for an awful tragedy. But what if that story is a lie? What if the truth isn't that simple at all? What if the media's rush to find a villain is distracting us from the very same questions the investigators themselves are still trying to answer? Because the official preliminary report doesn't tell a story of sabotage. It tells a story of confusion, of a deep and terrifying mystery that the media has decided to just ignore. After a preliminary report has been released, one narrative quickly took shape, fueled by leaks and blasted out by news outlets everywhere. That story focused on one single fact: the position of two switches in the cockpit. The preliminary report from India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, or AAIB, confirmed it. Just 3 seconds after takeoff, both of the plane's engine fuel control switches were moved from run to cut off. This action starved the engines of fuel, causing a total loss of thrust. At such a low altitude, recovery was impossible. For a lot of people, this seemed open and shut. Switches don't just move on their own. Headlines from international and domestic media immediately framed the crash around the pilot's actions, pointing the finger directly at them. The story became about what a person did, whether on purpose or by some unbelievable mistake. But this is where the media's story and the investigation's reality completely split apart. Because the AAIB, the only official group in charge of finding the truth, has been crystal clear, the report does not assign blame. It just states the facts. And the biggest fact is that the reason why those switches moved is still the single biggest unanswered question of this whole disaster. India's own civil aviation minister told the public not to guess, stating plainly that this report is just the beginning and no one should be jumping to conclusions. The bombshell on the black box. To really get why this is a mystery and not a closed case, you have to step inside the cockpit. The single most important piece of evidence that shatters the simple story of pilot error comes from the cockpit voice recorder, which captured the chilling, final words between the two pilots. Seconds after the engines started to fail, one pilot asks the other a desperate, confused question: "Why did you cut off?" The answer comes back instantly: "I didn't." Let that sink in. That isn't the sound of a coordinated, evil plan. It's the sound of utter confusion. It's the sound of two professionals being caught in a crisis, trying to figure out what was happening to their plane. This one exchange completely undermines the idea that this was a deliberate act by either pilot. It points to something that neither of them expected or started, an event that blindsided them during the most critical moment of the flight. And the data recorder backs them up. About 10 seconds after the fuel was cut, the switches were flipped back to the run position. The pilots were fighting to restart the engines. They were fighting to get power back. They were fighting to stop the disaster. But with only a few hundred feet of altitude, they just ran out of time. These aren't the actions of people trying to crash a plane, they're the actions of people trying desperately to save it. A rush to judgment. So if the official report doesn't blame the pilots, and the cockpit recording shows they were just as stunned as anyone, why did the pilot error story take hold so quickly and so powerfully? The answer seems to be a nasty pattern of leaks and media guesswork. The Airline Pilots Association of India, or ALPA, pointed out that private details from the investigation were being leaked to international news even before the official report was released in India. This let one version of the story, the one blaming the pilots, get cemented in the public mind before anyone had the full picture. ALPA has publicly and loudly called this out, saying that the tone and direction of the investigation suggest a bias towards pilot error. They, and other aviation experts, are warning everyone not to scapegoat the crew. As former Air Force officer Wing Commander Bharat Bhushan said, "It's difficult to believe that a pilot would deliberately put off the switch and endanger his own life. To have jumped into that and blamed the Indian pilots, which I think is not justified." And we've seen this before. After other major plane crashes, the first reports often blame the flight crew, only for the final investigation to find a deep mechanical or software problem later on. The worry that many pilots share is that this rush to judgment doesn't just ruin the reputations of the crew, it risks completely missing a technical problem that could put future flights in danger. The Pilots Association is so worried about the lack of transparency and the story being built around the crash that they've demanded to be included as observers in the investigation. They believe that without their input, the truth could get buried under a mountain of speculation. The unexamined possibility. So if we put aside the theory of a suicidal pilot, what are investigators really looking at? Their job is to look at everything, and that includes the switches themselves. These switches are designed to be hard to move by accident, but the investigation now has to consider if there was some kind of mechanical failure or a hidden design flaw. And there's a history here. The preliminary report itself points to a critical document, a 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin from the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. This bulletin warned about a potential problem with the locking mechanism on these exact fuel control switches in several Boeing models, including the 787. It specifically noted that the switch's lock could fail, making it possible to be moved by accident. Because this bulletin was just a warning, not a mandatory order, the suggested checks weren't done by the airline. Now, this doesn't prove that this specific fault caused the crash. The investigation is still very much ongoing, and as the AAIB said, no final conclusions have been made. But it's a massive piece of the puzzle. It's a known, documented vulnerability in the exact system at the heart of this tragedy. It offers a plausible alternative to the media's pilot blame narrative, and you can be sure it's a path investigators are taking very, very seriously. The AAIB has not ruled out a technical cause. They are looking at every component, every piece of data, and every possible scenario. The real story of I-171 isn't written yet. It's being carefully uncovered in a hangar, not being whipped up for a deadline in a newsroom. The story the media sold you about Air India 171 was simple, it was dramatic, and it fit a narrative they love to tell. But it's a story built on speculation, not evidence. It's a lie of omission, one that ignores the huge questions and contradictions sitting right inside the official preliminary report. The report doesn't blame the pilots. The cockpit voice recorder captures their shock, not their guilt. Aviation experts and pilot associations are warning us against this dangerous rush to judgment, because an unexamined technical flaw is a threat to all of us who fly. The real story of I-171 is a profound mystery. We still don't know what made those switches move. Was it a hidden technical flaw? A freak malfunction? That's what the investigators are working day and night to figure out. The real lesson here is about the need to wait for facts instead of feeding on fear. It's about trusting the slow, careful, evidence-based work of a real investigation instead of the hype of a 24-hour news cycle. The families of the victims, and all of us, deserve the real, complete truth, no matter how complicated it is. If you appreciate looking past the headlines to get to the real story, think about subscribing to this channel. Join a community that believes the full story matters.